the federal government using its power through the United States Army to assist in the pioneer settlement of Oregon. Fort Orford had been established by a man named William Titchener as a commercial enterprise. This was at the height of the gold rush, and the city of Jacksonville was at that time the biggest city in Oregon, and people from San Francisco and Portland and Willamette Valley converged on the Rogue River Valley to try to strike it rich with gold. William Titchener was thinking ahead, and he looked at Port Orford on the Oregon coast and said, that's how I can make money, by supplying those mines, because it was only about 70 miles as the crow flies between Fort Orford and Jacksonville. So he established that town site, and then sent his own people to blaze a trail up the Rogue River to reach Jacksonville. And they got lost and attacked by Indians. That is, to this day, one of the most rugged wilderness areas in Oregon, and to drive that 60 or 70 miles as the crow flies takes 4 hours between Jacksonville and Fort Orford to this very day. So the Army came to Titchener's rescue and established Fort Orford and sent these dragoons to Fort Orford. They left port on December 27th, San Francisco. They crossed the Golden Gate and immediately were hit with a gale. According to the memoirs, the ship was leaky, and the 22 dragoons on board had to take turns manning the pumps for the 3 or 4 days they were en route. In the middle of the night on January 3rd, 1852, they hit a sandbar and were lifted over that sandbar and came to a rest broadside to the beach. And in the pre-dawn hours, they didn't know if they were alive or dead. All the men were hunkered down below decks, and the waves were crashing over the top of the ship. And the captain ordered double-strong grog to be served around. They passed it around in 2 wooden buckets, drinking, waiting for dawn to see what would happen. But when dawn came, they found out that they were alive. They were on the north spit of Coos Bay in 5 feet of water. They happened to crash at a really high tide, and they began to offload the ship. And they had all this valuable cargo on board. And for the next 4 months, they sat there on the north spit of Coos Bay while the Army figured out what to do. 22 guys plus a handful of sailors. The local Native Americans from the village of Honasich, which is where North Bend now stands, came to visit them and help them offload the ship, and they began to trade with the dragoon soldiers there. They built a tent city, and they took the stove from the ship's galley and set up a kitchen. They erected a mast as a flagpole, and they set up military discipline, and Lieutenant Stanton would travel back and forth to the Umpqua River and Fort Orford trying to figure out what to do with all this cargo. Eventually, to make a long story short, Morris Miller, the quartermaster, and Stanton got a ship. They chartered a ship at the mouth of the Umpqua, the Fawn, and with the captain of Captain Lincoln as pilot, it entered Coos Bay, and this was in May of 1852, offloaded all the cargo, and Camp Castaway was abandoned. That's very briefly the story of Camp Castaway. Having located the site, we went out there to see what we could find. These are the archaeologists working on the site. We started out with a ground-penetrating radar survey, which is a remote sensing technique to look beneath the ground. This was a Southern Oregon University class that we hold in the summertime, and included the participation of the Coquel Indian tribe and the Confederated tribes of Kusla, Umpqua, Sayusla, using the radar waves bounce off artifacts and features below the ground. And using that, we targeted some of those places, and we dug in the sand dunes and collected a large number of artifacts from the Captain Lincoln, and many of them were in very poor condition given the rusty, given the salt water. So, for example, this is a blunt bolt. The memoirs talk about the ship being a rickety old ship, and the archaeology confirms that. There are many of these things are like pieces of rebar that the sailors would drive between the beams on the ship to keep an old ship together. And you can see how rusty it is, but it still retains some integrity. This is our laboratory procedures. We X-ray the artifacts and then use an electrolysis process to reverse the rusting, and that's the same artifact after its conservation. And there was a large number of architectural remains from Captain Lincoln at the site. These are spikes that were part of the architectural aspects of the vessel. More of these blunt bolts that are indicative of the poor condition of the ship. This is a chain bolt that is part of the rigging of Captain Lincoln, and that confirms archaeologically that they were dismantling the ship and dragging it ashore. It's a shipwreck on land, so to speak, and these are all hand-forged 19th century technology. These iron or ferrous metal spikes would have been used above the waterline on the ship's superstructure, and there you can see the hand-forged heads of these spikes. There were also copper spikes, which were in 19th century maritime technology, were below the waterline, and many of them, we would find them in clusters, and they were all sheared at the same angle, as it were two beams were torqued apart in the wreck of the ship, which was kind of a neat detail. And the hull of the ship was sheathed in copper, and we found today, you think of them like roofing nails, the kind of nails that would hold that copper sheeting to the deck, or to the hull of the ship, and there they are in the field, and the copper acted as a preservative and preserved some of the wood of the Captain Lincoln's hull around the actual nails. And then this is in turn some of the copper sheeting, which we found deliberately cut up, which was done either by the dragoons to trade to Native American people, or after the camp was abandoned, Native American people did that themselves. Indians really appreciated metal from the American pioneers. Other parts of the ship and cargo were in bad condition. That's a barrel hoop that, as we excavated it in the field, and that was a ghost of itself. It was just a rusty stain in the soil, so we pulled the dirt out from around it and got the dimensions on it, and that's a barrel hoop, so that was part of the cargo of Captain Lincoln that they hauled out of the ship. But that didn't come out of the ground. It came out and it was basically rust-colored sand. The dragoons and Camp Castaway, we found some aspects of their stay there over 4 months, including these percussion caps, which were how they fired their weapons. They spent a lot of time apparently just firing at their guns out of boredom or for weapons drill. And musket balls, and this was a standard 69 caliber and 31 caliber cartridge that would go into what they called musketoons that were used by the dragoons, and they were locked together in a paper bag with gunpowder. That was the standard cartridge of the dragoons at that time. Not too much in the way of domestic artifacts, but we did see them attempt to establish some kind of domestic normalcy. There were alcohol bottles there and china plates, and their memoirs of that do talk about maintaining some military discipline and having enlistments, barracks, and the like. Like at Fort Lane, we also found at least one glass trade bead, which was universal currency for Americans who wanted to interact with Indians, and at least one of these dragoons or sailors brought some glass trade beads with them. And military buttons identical to those at Fort Lane. So Captain Lincoln, that was the U.S. government's using the United States Army to ensure the success of this early pioneer venture. And that's how the first dragoons came to Oregon. They would go on to establish Fort Lane, and that would administer the Table Rock Reservation until the fall of 1855, when the last paroxysm of violence of the Rogue River Wars took place. And that started on October 8th, 1855. Lieutenant Schweitzer was awake in his cabin at dawn, and he heard gunfire off in the distance. This is on October 8th, 1855. And that gunfire was a vigilante group from Jacksonville led by a man named James Lupton, who went down to the Rogue River. This is about where Tuvale State Park is today, and attacked 3 Indian villages on the border of the Table Rock Indian Reservation and massacred their inhabitants. Lieutenant Schweitzer was ordered by Captain Smith to ride out to the Lupton to the site, and the pioneers fled at his approach, and they took the surviving Indians back to Fort Lane. And that's a complete inversion of that narrative of the cavalry running to the rescue of the pioneers. In the aftermath of the Lupton massacre, the Native Americans on the reservation basically took one of two approaches. Some trusted to the government and went to Fort Lane for protection against the pioneer lynch mobs. The rest, and these were led by the Indian chiefs John, Limpy, and George, basically decided to fight it out, and they traveled westward down the Oregon-California Trail, following the route of today's I-5, and killed every white person they could find and burned down every cabin they could find, and then holed up in relatively inaccessible areas. Chief John took his people up to Deer Creek up on the Illinois River, and George and Limpy went up into the Grave Creek Hills in the highlands between the Rogue River and Cow Creek. And that was a very violent moment. The citizen militia and the federal soldiers at Fort Lane dropped their animosity for a brief period of time. I think of it as like a 9/11 moment when all the political differences were set aside against this horrible event that had happened. And they agreed to work together to fight this battle. They had to find the quote-unquote hostiles, though. So Captain Smith of Fort Lane and a man named John Ross, who's a quote-unquote Indian fighter from Jacksonville, led their, just tried to find the George, Limpy, and John, who at that were waging guerrilla warfare by that time. The Battle of Hungry Hill was what happened. The Battle of Hungry Hill was what happened when those dragoons and citizen militias found the hostile encampment of Native Americans in the Grave Creek Hills. And it happened between October 30th and November 1st, 1855. The word of what happened at the Battle of the Hungry Hill reached the settlements of the Willamette Valley a couple days later. And this is a quote from the newspaper at the time, the Oregon Statesman. And this is how people back in the settlements heard about the battle. It said, "The war in the South has become a real and earnest affair. The battle in the Grave Creek Hills has proved most disastrous to our side. It is supposed that there were not more than 100 fighting Indians engaged in the action. The loss on the side of the Indians was very trifling, probably not more than 7 or 8 killed. The Indians had taken a position in the mountains about 15 miles west of the road to Jacksonville, an almost inaccessible place. After 2 days of hardest kind of fighting, the Indians were left in possession of the field. In about 10 days, it is proposed to renew the attack. The exterminators are rather down in the mouth. Those are the people that attacked the Indians on the reservation. Major Ross was present in command of the Southern Battalion. God only knows when or where this war may end." And that's is a pretty sober assessment of what happened. It was a resounding defeat for the American forces, one of the biggest defeats of the United States Army at the hands of an Indian force in the history of the American West. But what's strange is that compared to other more famous battles like the Sand Creek Massacre, the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Battle of Hungry Hill, which is in scale a very huge fight. It was like 300 Americans and 100, 200 Native Americans, and it was a major defeat. It's like it's not part of our history, and I was curious why. And the actual location of the battlefield was missing. Now, when you jump ahead to that era of pioneer memoir, like this one here from 1884, it paints a picture of the Battle of Hungry Hill that's very romantic, and well, we'll read it. "When news of the butchery of the Harrises, Wagners, and the other unfortunates reached the mines and farms, the entire male population of the Rogue River Valley sprang to arms with a unanimity and promptness in consonance with the extreme gravity of the situation. The inhabitants of every mining camp enrolled themselves for duty against the despoilers. The command of the military had devolved, by right of his commission as colonel in the 9th Regiment of Oregon Militia, upon John E. Ross, an Indian fighter of great experience, judgment, and resolution. The company commanders numbered several men who had already achieved celebrity by their conflicts with the red men. James Bruce was there, characteristically impatient to fall upon the foe. Jacob Reinerson had left his claim on Cow Creek at the first news of the massacre, and assembling perhaps 200 of his neighbors, had arrived upon the bloody ground almost before the corpses of the slain men, women, and children had stiffened in death. Welton Griffin, T. Smiley Harris, Wilkinson, and other men of might and courage were there, whose names yet linger in the recollections of the people of Southern Oregon and are not likely to be forgotten as long as bravery and hardihood possess a charm." So that was an anonymous memoir written 40 years after the fact that celebrates the heroism of the participants of the Battle of Hungry Hill in this defeat. So a few years ago, we began, Southern Oregon University, the Bureau of Land Management, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the Cow Creek Tribe, Grand Ronde Tribe, we all worked together to try to find this location. We also had the help of Ben Truey of the Southern Oregon Historical Society and an Army historian, Colonel Daniel Edgerton. And we assembled as many written documents that we could, and we conducted archaeological survey. The location is in the highlands between Cow Creek and the Rogue River, west of Interstate 5. And we basically spent several years conducting field research with metal detectors, walking at likely locations in the forest. And after a number of years, and it proved challenging, very dense vegetation. This is John Craig, who is one of our surveyors, who's basically rappelling down a steep slope in heavy brush while simultaneously metal detecting. And then eventually we found the Battle of Hungry Hill. Once again, 69 caliber musket balls and a lid to a gunpowder container. We were aided by an actual map that Captain Ross and Captain Smith drew for the battle. And once again, to make a fairly long story short, it was a classic story of what can go wrong. Captain Smith had originally planned to divide his forces into three and surround the Indian forces. And this is a map that shows that plan. But what actually happened was, as they left at 11 o'clock at night and they wanted to march through the night and surprise them at dawn. But they all got lost in the woods, and instead of coming up surrounding the Indian encampment, they arrived in front of the Indian encampment in a single spot. And they almost shot at each other, thinking that they were the enemy force. And when they realized what had happened, they were trying to figure out what to do. And against orders, some of the men lit a tree on fire. This is after marching all night. They were cold, and two of the military officers were described as being too drunk to proceed. It was kind of pandemonium, and the discipline of the men broke down. And they saw the Indian encampment on the further ridgeline. And all 300 men, or most of them, just went for it and they ran. And if you look at this picture, their charge went from the east side of that. They went from the left side of this picture down into a valley 1,500 feet, and then up to the next ridgeline another 1,500 feet. And they took them 2 hours to do that, charging and yelling. And then, so instead of their carefully laid out plan to envelop the Native American encampment, they made the biggest mistake in military tactics and attacked a prepared position head on. And they got annihilated. These are two eyewitness quotes from what happened next. The first onset of the troops drove the Indians from the crest of the ridge into the cover and shelter of the trees and chaparral of the descending slope. Concealed in this excellent cover and stripped for the fight, they quickly checked our progress by their telling fire and laid orders to combat on a large number of troops. And then one Lieutenant Kaut, said, "One of ours, Gillespie, was killed and several wounded, and this one dead man won the battle, and 2/3 of the men never got past this one dead body." And we were able, through archaeological survey, to identify different parts of the battlefield. These are 69 caliber musket balls, some fired, some not fired. And in some degree of detail, we were able to track out the movement of the battle of both sides of both forces over the course of the day. The Americans unsuccessfully tried to bludgeon their way through the Indian position, but failed. This is a shot roughly where John Gillespie was killed. This was after one of our forest fires took across the landscape. And two more quotes from that battle. It was a horrible battle. There was that little group of devils protected behind their fortifications, dead sure of their own safety. We, a lot of greenhorns, hardly knowing how to hold a rifle, we fell like game before the good huntsman's aim. I remember one half-breed named Venus, he was called. He had himself ensconced in a hollow pine tree that almost hit him, and there he blazed away with the crack of his telescope rifle as easily from a porthole. He was a deadly shot, too, that fellow. And here's a case where a memoir written later agrees with the contemporary source, because another man said, in 1855, it is said that much of the execution was done by one Indian who lay concealed behind a root. The crack of his rifle could be heard over all the others. And whenever the smoke was seen to rise from behind that root, a white man was almost sure to be killed or wounded. And this is an image that shows the rough position of the Indian sniper, and we found fired ammunition where the American weapons had attempted to reach him. In any case, the battle ended in a rout, and they spent the night at a place called Bloody Springs, and the next morning they were evacuated out to the settlements. And many of the memoirs, private memoirs, unpublished ones, admitted that they basically wanted to forget that the battle had actually happened. The war would continue over the wintertime. It was not the quick victory they were looking for. Ben Truey of the Southern Oregon Historical Society found an amazing letter written by one of the Army officers, Lieutenant August B. Kautz. Once again, one of these junior officers would gain some fame in the Civil War later on. And he wrote a private letter to Joseph Lane, a politician who lived in the Roseburg area at that time. And it creates a in contrast to the romanticized pioneer memoirs, it has a very sober assessment of what had happened. And I'll end with this quote. And Lieutenant Kautz, who participated in the battle, his assessment was, "The unpleasant truth is that the whites were cowards. They were wiped out by 1/4 of their numbers of Indians. And had it not been 30 or 40 good men, the rest would have broke and run. As it was, some did break and never stopped. The great secret of the failure is that the volunteers expected the regulars to do all the fighting, whilst the regulars were expecting the same thing from the volunteers. I do not think much of the conduct of the officers. Nobody attempted to lead the men, and I don't think that Colonel Ross or Captain Smith attempted to fire a gun. There was a want of confidence all around. It is a war they have brought on themselves. The Indians are fighting in self-defense, and they fight well. I have every reason to believe that it has been gotten up expressly to procure another appropriation. I fear you paid them too well for their meritorious service in 1853. War is a money-making business." Thanks.